In this video, I'll be unboxing the Battle for Azeroth Collector's Edition and asking, is it really worth your money if you haven't picked it up already? So, Battle for Azeroth has been live for a few weeks now, and it's been overwhelmingly embraced by the community. The in-game content storytelling is absolutely fantastic, and it captures a lot of the excitement of previous expansions, while also tapping into a lot of nostalgia from earlier games like Warcraft 3. The outer game storytelling has been just as great for me, whether it's the Warbringer videos, which have set the stage for the quite literally enormous conflict to come, or the Old Soldier cinematic, which tells the tale of what I guess is a budding romance between an orc overlord and a troll soldier.
You have bewitched me, body and soul, and I love you.
Did no one else get that impression? Anyways, the launch of BFA has been fantastic, and we can only hope the honeymoon feeling that WoW has going for it right now continues well into the later patches. But there is one part of Battle for Azeroth's launch that is getting a fair bit of negative attention, and it surrounds something that is becoming somewhat a smaller and smaller part of the release overall, and that's the physical Collector's Edition. Now, Collector's Editions have always been a huge part of WoW. Every new expansion is marked by long-time players sharing how committed they are to the game and IKEA furniture shopping. But this edition has got the community in quite a spin, and if details of what was in BFA's Collector's Edition didn't put people off in the first place, it seems that it's definitely upset people who committed to buying it in the end. So in this video, I'm going to try and answer two very basic questions. Firstly, how does this Collector's Edition compared to previous ones, and is it really worth your money if you haven't picked it up already? And I guess since I've posed those questions, I should probably answer them, so let's get stuck in. And where better to start a review of a collector's edition than the packaging, and it's a pretty important part. You're going to be staring at that box for a lot more time than you will most of the things inside it, so it's worth taking a quick but closer look at. Now, in case you were worrying that Blizzard's tried to save a bit of money off the bat by skimping out on the packaging materials, don't fear. This edition is made from the same reinforced cardboard as the others and will easily weather the bumps and bruises that any collector can throw at it. In fact, it's because these collector's editions are so resilient to wear and tear that I often don't worry about picking them up second hand, and I'd encourage you to consider it as well if you're looking for out-of-print expansions. However, let's get to the real focus, the box's artwork. On the front we get the title, as you would expect, but it's set over a really nice backdrop of fractured earth and what I believe are veins of Azerite. Often with front panels there isn't much to pick up on, but it's nice that they've made the Azerite a subtle backdrop for this cover, in the same way that it's a rather significant backdrop for the events of the game itself. Nevertheless, these boxes are generally designed to be filed away like books, and so the spine is where we find a bit more to get our teeth into. And when we look at previous editions, we start to see a bit of an interesting pattern. For example, on Wrath of the Lich King's Collector's Edition, the spine bears the sigil of the Lich King and his iconic crown. On Cataclysms, we get the sigil of Deathwing. On Mists of Pandaria's, we get the sigil of the Mogu. On Warlords of Draenor's, we get the sigil of the Iron Horde, and so on. You get the idea. What I'm trying to show is that on each Collector's Edition, the spine seems to offer a glimpse as to what we're fighting against, if not at the end of an expansion, then certainly en route to it. But what do we get on Battle for Azeroth's spine? Well, unsurprisingly, we get Azeroth. Now, when I first thought of this, I figured that these islands we can see were Kulturas and Zandalar, and the spine was showing us what we were fighting over and against in a kind of twist on previous Collector's Edition spines. However, then I realised that the focus for Azeroth in this sigil, if you will, is not the islands per se, but the ocean between them. And if you look real close, you can see that the centre patch of ocean is much darker than the surrounding water. So the spine in fact carries on the tradition of showcasing the larger enemy in this expansion, and BFA chooses to linger on an unseen foe beneath the waves. Now, I think this is such a cool element for this box, given that they had not explicitly confirmed Azeroth until recently, and it's something that very few people will ever pay attention to. Once again, we see Blizzard being explicit in the most subtle of ways. So that's the packaging. Let's get stuck into the box at hand, because really that's where all of the upset has come from. You'll instantly know I'm picking up the box that it's a lot lighter than previous collector's editions, and that's because, well, there's less in it, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But for me, opening up a collector's edition is actually a really important thing, because for players like me who prefer physical over digital, it's actually the first time I'm properly engaging with the expansion. So what I find inside has to get me excited, it has to get me pumped to log in, start that grind to max level, and take on the adventures ahead. So when we open up this box, what are we met with? Well, straight away we find the hard copy version of Novella's Elegy and A Good War. Now, I think this book is the strongest part of the edition, so I'll come back to it in more detail later, but overall I think this is a great way to greet players before this expansion, instantly presenting us with a visual reminder of how binary the conflicts in Azeroth have become despite everything we went through in Legion, while also offering us a prelude to how we got here. On both covers you'll also get a collector's number, and they've done a really nice job of making this book reversible, both to allow you to have your faction's cover as the true one, if you will, and to clearly play up the concept of two sides and two perspectives to this war, with each faction turning the other's world quite literally upside down. So once you've carefully taken the novellas out, you find yourself confronted with everything that's left all at once. At the top is the double-sided faction medallion, undoubtedly the most eye-catching feature of this collector's edition, so it's where we'll start next. Now, the medallion is a pretty hefty piece, crafted from a lightweight metal and weighing probably a little bit more than an Xbox controller. On both sides you get some really subtle details, such as small dents and chips in the piece's outer ring. On the Horde side it gives a sense of the hard-handed way in which it was crafted, and on the Alliance side it gives a sense of wear and tear in the battlefield. I also like how they've given the Horde sigil a wooden texture and the Alliance's one a stone texture. For me, this captures that age-old dichotomy between the factions going back to Warcraft 3, particularly in respects to technology and culture, with the Horde's rustic approach to technology contrasted with the more sophisticated approaches of the Alliance. Thankfully, it also comes with a display stand. Now, this is made of plastic, and if you handle it, it does feel a little bit flimsy, but I guess it's not supposed to be anything more than a display support, so I'm not too worried about its construction. It comes together easy enough, it's well padded at the base, and it comfortably carries the piece in a manner that certainly adds to the air of fantasy surrounding it. Overall, I really like it. It's a nice piece of memorabilia to have displayed next to your PC as you're playing, and you'll likely find that it sits quite comfortably with any other ornaments you have placed around your setup. Wait, Widowmaker, get out of here, you've already had your video. God, she thinks she can go where she bloody well pleases. That aside, let's move back to the novellas. Now, these stories in and of themselves are absolutely fantastic. Written by Christy Golden and Robert Brooks and shaped by a lot of well-known faces in Blizzard, Elegy and A Good War present the War of Thorns from the perspectives of both Alliance and Horde characters. Now, without spoiling them, and I wholly recommend you check out the PDF versions of these online if you haven't already, I feel these stories do a wonderful job of illustrating the importance of perspective in war. Throughout both, we see how somewhat insignificant moments for one set of characters are completely world-changing for others, and this imbalance, I feel, is part of the shades of grey concept that Blizzard is playing up in Battle for Azeroth. But at the start of this video, I said that this book was my favourite part of the Collector's Edition, and I stand by that for two reasons. Firstly, as I hinted to earlier, I see the contents of World of Warcraft Collector's Editions as gateways to the game. What I find inside is meant to immerse me in and excite me for the conflict to come. And I think that's the role that the art book played for a lot of people, by showcasing the artistic and cinematic inspirations behind the expansion, whilst also whetting players' lore appetite, so to speak. But in Battle for Azeroth, the War of Thorns is the gateway event. It sets everything else into motion. So I actually find it rather apt that Blizzard has given us, as collectors, a way to commemorate that major event by owning the stories in physical form. As such, when you open the box up, you're actually being presented with the events that stand between you and the expansion, both figuratively and quite literally, and I think that's a really nice aspect to the overall experience. All of this, however, doesn't even begin to address the quality of the book, which is simply beautiful. The cover is wonderfully illustrated with dark and glistening colours, and they've again chosen to use that same Azerite backdrop from before, once again illustrating how the blood of Azeroth is also a backdrop for this one conflict. It's also textured to give it a nice tactile sensation when you're holding it in your hands, offering a premium quality from the get-go. The stories are printed on high quality paper, and to me at least, the texture seems to be so well laid out for the printed versions of these stories. Unlike the PDF, the printed version uses a dual column layout, which means you don't have to move your eyes as much when you're reading. That might be something that only I appreciate, but it was certainly a welcome consideration. But the real draw of this hardback are the incredible illustrations dotted throughout. Every few pages you get a new sketch, sometimes simple and other times very complex, which do a wonderful job in the first instance of breaking up the story and giving you a bit of a chance to pause and reflect on the events taking place. Their placement, sometimes in the corners of pages, sometimes taking up whole pages, really seems to take into account the reading experience and make what would otherwise be a scroll fest into a contemplative and well-paced journey. More so though, the sketches add so much more depth to some of these moments, which otherwise are only coloured by our own interpretation. I don't want to spoil any of these, but to show you what I mean, let's just take one quick example. Towards the end of Elegy, we get a description of the closing moments of the War of Thorns as Teldrassil is set ablaze. What was controlled chaos is described as turning into sheer panic as Night Elf citizens try desperately to be one of the last few to escape before everything comes crashing in around them. Kaldorei desperately shoved and clawed their way past one another at the portals. Tyrande, Anduin, the Stormwind Guards and the Sentinels pulled coughing evacuees to safety, shoved them in the direction of the ramp and reached through the portals for more. The smoke thickened, black and choking, and it became harder to see those on the other side. It's a terrifying image, but a page before it we get this incredible sketch of the scene at hand. What it shows is not only the scene as described, but also what isn't described. For example, we can see the powerful gusts and winds that are being fueled as the blaze inside one city on Azeroth is channeled into a city on the other side of it. And amongst the throngs of people, we get two characters who really stand out for me. One is this collapsed Night Elf who has succumbed to his wounds. He's simply left huddled on the ground and no one, either from sheer panic or ignorance, is stopping to help him. The other is this character sitting on the step. As people flee to safety, he's seen to be overcome with grief. He's not waiting to see if anyone follows him. What he's grieving for is already lost. And that in itself has so many interpretations we can draw on. It's just one example, but what I want to show you is how the hardback novella is truly a wonderful book. It presents not only two of the best stories in Warcraft lore, but it packs them with well-placed and meaningful art to create an experience truly worthy of a collector's edition. But if I was to make just one criticism of the novellas, it would be the inconsistency in the art. The sketches spread across both stories are all in monotone, and I think that's a really nice touch. It brings an air of authenticity to the book, as though it had been chronicled by scholars in a fantasy world such as Azeroth. However, you find yourself reading through both novellas and glancing across the artwork, only to be met by this beautifully coloured image of the burning of Teldrassil, which I find a bit odd. Don't get me wrong, I understand why this image is here. It serves as a great focal point for the two stories, bringing the events of both together in a singular but striking scene. However, I have to ask the question, why is this the only image in colour? Some of the more complex imagery would have been even more stunning in colour, so I find it odd that they haven't been given that treatment. Now, maybe the artists didn't have the time or weren't inclined to colour the pieces, but I feel somewhat teased by having such a vibrant image at the heart of a largely monotone book. Then again, it only serves to make that central scene more striking, and in that respect, I can completely understand the creative choice being made. Yet, despite all my nitpicking, I actually think this image has one subtle and vitally important message. Do you remember how I said that by reversing the book for each story, it played up the idea that each faction's world had been turned upside down? Well, the interesting thing is that this image sits upright if you read it from the Alliance side, and it is actually upside down if you read it from the Horde side. Now, in reality, they had to print it up one way, so one faction was going to get the right orientation. But looking at these closing passages from each story, I think it actually perfectly illustrates the frame of mind for each faction. Towards the end of Elegy, we read of how resolute Anduin and the other Alliance leaders are, that war must now come. Teldrassil must be avenged. In that sense, they are seeing the situation for what it truly is, and they perfectly comprehend the reality ahead of them. In complete contrast, at the end of a good war, we see how stunned and shocked Saurfang and members of the Horde are by Sylvanas' drastic decision. What was meant to be a glorious conquest becomes a genocide, and in that sense, it is the Horde's world, their perception of reality, that is suddenly upturned by the burning of Teldrassil. One faction is resolute in defeat, the other is disorientated in victory. Now, unfortunately, that's pretty much all of the physical items you're going to get in this physical collector's edition, and that's what has people so frustrated. Gone are the art books that came with the previous expansions, along with the behind-the-scenes DVDs and the themed mouse mats. And it's not just those extras, neither the game nor soundtrack get a physical presence, and are simply relegated to code form, albeit some thought has gone into at least presenting those codes in a tidy envelope. Now, even when I knew what was coming in this collector's edition, I did get to the end of unboxing it and think to myself, is this it? And it does feel a little bit empty, I'm not going to lie, especially when you compare it to previous collector's editions before it. However, one of the questions I said I would try and answer in this video is, how does this Collector's Edition compare to previous ones? And to answer that accurately, I think I need to draw a distinction between what you find in the box and the experience it's trying to offer. What I mean by that is that for previous WoW Collector's Editions, I've almost always taken the physical soundtrack, added it to my PC library, and then never really touched it again. So, with a code for a website that downloads that music in 4 different file formats, am I not getting the same experience, perhaps even a better one, albeit from a different product? In truth, I don't mind not getting the game and soundtrack in physical formats. The moment I enter the codes, they've served their purpose, and I don't really need them taking up the space. Now, some people might disagree if, for example, they listen to the soundtrack in their car, but I don't think it's too harsh to expect people in that position to possibly burn a CD of their own. Heck, they're all over YouTube by this point, so their exclusivity is non-existent, and it's already so easy to access the soundtracks no matter where you are. So, in respects to the game soundtrack and all the digital extras, the experience for me at least is still the same. What we don't have are an art book, behind the scenes DVD and a mouse mat, but instead we have a medallion and a hardback novella series with exclusive art, and I think that's more than a fair trade. Now, I doubt anyone is really missing the mouse mat, and if you do, there are a ton of websites that you can get one from, including Blizzard's own gear store, which is probably why they haven't included one here. And the behind the scenes DVDs are probably better suited for YouTube in all honesty. I'm thinking in particular of the behind the scenes content that Heroes of the Storm has done, and how that has been a great source of community engagement. The issue though, for a lot of people, is the art book. But if I'm quite honest, I'm glad it's not in the Collector's Edition this time, and let me explain why. When I look at these art books, I love seeing the development sketches, the potential enemies, weapons and locations that were created and then evolved into the ones that made it into the final game. However, let's take Legions as an example. We get beautiful artwork on the class artifact weapons and tier armour, the initial dungeons and the zones of the Broken Isles, all the way up to Suramar. What we don't get though are all the sketches of the Nighthold, later dungeons introduced after launch, or anything from Argus, including the sketches of the Titans, some of the most pivotal characters in WoW. In fact, the dungeon and raid section of Legion's artbook is only 8 pages in a book that has over 170 pages of content, and that's shocking on one level. However, there is a reason they can't put it in the artbook, because it would spoil the expansion, and some of it was likely still being designed when they pulled this all together. In fact, in Wrath's artbook, Blizzard has tried to get around this exact issue by dedicating a whole section at the end to artwork from the later Burning Crusade patches. Clearly they wanted somewhere to showcase these iconic pieces, but they just couldn't do it in the original Burning Crusade artbook when the game was first released. So I would ask, what would BFA's artbook have had? And more importantly, what wouldn't it have had? In short, it wouldn't have had any sketches or artwork past Uldir, and that would be threadbare itself if previous artbooks are anything to go by. So instead, I'd much rather have an artbook at the end of the expansion, a way to mark the close of a chapter by showing everything that went into that story, artistically, cinematically and the like. Blizzard can then include all the raids and dungeons, all the enemies and major characters that play a part right up to the end of the story, and even the development sketches for the incredible Warbringer videos that have only recently been released. In fact, I'd much rather have this type of artbook with added interviews with the people and teams behind them. Kind of a cross between a behind the scenes DVD and an art book, but just in much more detail and covering the whole expansion. Now, Blizzard might not do that, and if they don't, then my point stands on shaky ground. Any art book is better than none, given how incredible the visual content has been in Battle for Azeroth recently. But in hindsight, I still feel that these art books capture a point in time at the launch of each expansion, rather than celebrating all of the artistic and cinematic inspirations that went into the whole experience. I still think they're wonderful, but as I glance through these pages, I tend to think a lot more about what I'm not seeing rather than what I am, and that's a shame. So let's close by answering those 2 questions I posed at the very start of the video. Firstly, how does this Collector's Edition compare to previous ones? Well, in some ways, I think it's actually a better Collector's Edition than previous ones, and the reason for that is that you still get the game and soundtrack. They're not in physical form, I admit, but the end experience is practically the same. But instead you get this wonderful novella and the medallion. Now, the novella, I feel, is a great piece to return to, one to read again and to immerse yourself in the same way you would return to any of the art books. You're getting a chance to experience a defining moment in WoW, and to have your interpretations and appreciation of that moment shaped by the incredible artwork in it. Similarly, the medallion is on display on my PC table right now, and it will stay there for quite a while. It's out, it's visible, and it's part of my gaming setup. So in many ways, it's doing much more for me as a WoW fan right now than any of the art books, behind the scenes DVDs and mouse mats from previous collector's editions, which are all still bundled up in their boxes. Overall, this collector's edition is a very different one to others, a very different approach by Blizzard, but one that I think better understands its role as a launch collectible. It takes value out of the things I don't need, which are largely non-exclusive, the game and soundtrack CDs for example, which again are all over YouTube now, and packs that value into the stuff that ultimately commemorates the game itself, and I think that is what makes it a fantastic piece for a collector. However, is it really worth your money if you haven't picked it up already? Well, obviously the value of any collectible is subjective, but I think you get what you pay for with this set. Here in the UK, it's only £40 more than the Digital Deluxe, and for that you get the soundtrack, medallion and the novella, and I think those three are certainly worth that upgrade. Of course, if you don't care for the Digital Deluxe items or aren't fussed about even just one of those three extras, then the value takes a hit and it probably isn't worth it for you. I personally feel like I got what I paid for, the game, a load of digital extras, and some physical memorabilia that come together as a really nice celebration of Warcraft at this moment in time. You may disagree, and that's totally cool, but then I guess there's always eBay for you to be able to pick up the stuff that you do actually want. So I hope this video has been useful, if not just to show why I think that this is a great collector's edition, then at least to help you to decide whether your choice to pick it up or not was a good one. Obviously, fingers crossed I'm right about that end of expansion art, but because it would totally suck if we weren't able to see the visual inspiration that has gone into some of this later Battle for Azeroth content. And whilst this content has started to appear on ArtStation, and it has got people worried that World of Warcraft art books won't be a thing in the future, I do think actually it paves the way for physical art books because it's bringing everything together into one place, and I don't think it's that much more of a step for Blizzard just to print all that stuff in physical form. Heck, we'd all buy it, so it's a pretty smart business decision. But overall, I do think this is a great collector's edition. It's a very different approach for an expansion that, for better or for worse, is trying to stand out from the pack. But much like the game content itself, whether it succeeds or not is down to personal preference. One thing I do hope I've been able to show is that the criticism, whilst fair, does actually leave a lot of room for some exciting content down the line, in a way that other expansions haven't given themselves the room to do so. But we'll have to wait and see. Until then, I want to thank you very much for joining me on this video. I hope to have you around for the next one, whatever that is. And until then, have a great day.